The race to Sidi Rezegh was not a clean cavalry dash across open desert, even though it can look that way from a distance. It was a movement of armored brigades, reconnaissance troops, support columns, headquarters, and supply vehicles toward a piece of ground south of Tobruk that would soon become the center of Operation Crusader. The British and Commonwealth offensive had begun with ambition and momentum, but the early fighting had already shown how easily the desert could break a plan into fragments. Bir el-Gubi had shocked British armor on the southern flank, El Adam had become a vital hinge near Tobruk, and now Sidi Rezegh drew the campaign toward a more dangerous climax.
Sidi Rezegh mattered because it sat close to the Axis siege front around Tobruk and near routes that linked the wider battlefield together. It was not important because it was large or glamorous. Its airfield, its nearby ridge, and its relationship to the tracks running across the desert gave it practical value. Whoever controlled the ground around Sidi Rezegh could threaten the southern approaches to Tobruk, interfere with Axis movement, and shape the possibility of relief. In desert warfare, such places became magnets. Armies that seemed to have limitless room to maneuver kept colliding around the same few points because those points helped them see, move, supply, and connect. The British armored push toward Sidi Rezegh carried the hopes of 30th Corps and the reputation of 7th Armored Division. The idea was to drive deep enough to force Rommel's mobile forces into battle and create the conditions for the Tobruk garrison to break outward. That required speed, but it also required concentration. A fast armored force that arrived in pieces could be defeated in pieces. A brigade that reached promising ground without artillery, infantry, fuel, or clear information might find itself exposed rather than victorious. The race to Sidi Rezegh was therefore not simply about who got there first. It was about whether arrival could be turned into control. The desert made that harder at every stage. Columns moved through dust that could hide them from the enemy, but also hide them from one another. Reports traveled slowly or arrived in forms that were already out of date. A commander might believe a neighboring unit was nearby, when in reality it had halted, drifted, or been pulled into a separate fight. Vehicles broke down during long moves, and even a small loss of mechanical strength could matter when the battle was widening. In a European landscape, villages, roads, and rivers might help units orient themselves. In the Western Desert, a formation could be moving with confidence and still be losing the larger thread. For British tank crews, the movement toward Sidi Rezegh offered both purpose and uncertainty. They knew the offensive was meant to relieve Tobruk, and they knew that the enemy's armored forces would have to be found and fought. But knowing the purpose of a campaign did not tell a crew what waited beyond the next rise. The enemy might be a patrol, an anti-tank screen, a battery, or a panzer force gathering for counterattack. Heat shimmer, dust, and distance could turn observation into guesswork. Tank warfare in this environment demanded aggression, but it punished blind aggression. Every mile forward increased both opportunity and exposure. Rommel's forces were also trying to understand the race as it unfolded. The Axis command had to judge whether the British thrust toward Sidi Rezegh was the main danger, a diversion, or one part of a wider attempt to pull the siege apart. Rommel still had to think about Tobruk, the frontier positions, El Adam, his mobile reserves, and his stretched supply situation. This is one reason the race had such tension. The British were trying to force a decision before the Axis response fully formed, while Rommel was trying to identify the decisive point quickly enough to strike. Both sides were moving through uncertainty, but each hoped the other would be slower to understand. The British problem was that different parts of the battle were already telling different stories. To the south, the fight at Bir el-Gubi had shown that Axis resistance was not going to collapse just because British armor appeared. Near Tobruk, the ground around El Adem remained critical and contested. Along the frontier, 13th Corps still had to deal with strongpoints that threatened the eastern side of the operation. In the middle of all this, the armored movement toward Sidi Rezegh had to remain focused. But the more crises appeared, the harder it became for headquarters to know whether the campaign was developing according to plan or beginning to come apart.
Sidi Rezegh also exposed the problem of fighting for an airfield in a tank campaign. An airfield sounds like a fixed objective, something to be seized and marked as captured. But in the desert, possession of a flat, exposed piece of ground was never simple. A force could drive onto it and still be vulnerable from the surrounding ridges and approaches. It could occupy the area without having enough infantry to secure it properly. It could claim the ground in the morning and be under counterattack by afternoon. This was the strange mix at the heart of Crusader. Everything seemed mobile, yet everyone kept fighting over fixed points that could not be safely ignored.
The ridge near Sidi Rezegh was especially important because height gave observation, and observation gave power. In open country, seeing the enemy first could decide whether artillery was brought down, whether anti-tank guns were positioned correctly, and whether tanks moved into danger or around it. A ridge did not have to be high by mountain standards to matter. It only had to give one side a better view across the approaches. Tanks moving below such ground could find themselves watched, ranged, and engaged before they fully understood the position. The race to Sidi Rezegh was therefore also a race for vision. Whoever controlled the ground could better understand the battle.
The British armored force needed to avoid the trap of mistaking motion for success. Moving towards Sidi Rezegh was essential, but moving did not automatically mean the enemy was being defeated. A column could be advancing while its flank became exposed. A brigade could report progress while its strength was being worn down by breakdowns and local actions. A commander could see dust clouds and believe friendly forces were converging when the battlefield was actually scattering them. This distinction is central to armored warfare. Operational movement is valuable only when it produces a usable result. Otherwise, speed becomes a way of arriving at the wrong place in the wrong condition.
For the Axis side, the British movement created danger but also opportunity. If British armor became spread out around Sidi Rezegh, El Adem, and the southern flank, Axis mobile forces could look for isolated targets. German and Italian units did not need to defeat the entire British offensive in one blow if they could break enough of its moving parts. Anti-tank guns, panzers, artillery, and local counterattacks could turn the British advance into a series of separate fights. Rommel's strength lay in recognizing such openings and striking quickly. The British therefore had to race not only against distance, but against the enemy's ability to concentrate faster than they could consolidate.
This is why the race to Sidi Rezegh felt like a contest between different maps of the same battle. British planners had one map in mind, with core missions, objectives, and a path toward Tobruk. Tank commanders on the ground had another, made of dust, ridges, enemy fire, fuel states, and radio messages. Rommel had yet another, shaped by opportunity, threat, and instinctive counterstroke. The men inside Tobruk had their own mental map, defined by the siege perimeter and the hope that relief would come close enough to meet. These maps overlapped, but they did not match perfectly. The campaign's danger came from that mismatch. By the time British forces were drawn toward Sidi Rezegh, Operation Crusader was entering the phase where intention and reality began to separate sharply. The offensive still had a chance to work, and the movement toward the airfield and ridge threatened the Axis siege system in a real way. But the fight was no longer developing as a clean sequence. It was becoming a race whose participants did not always know where the others were, how strong they remained, or which local action would suddenly become decisive. In the larger history of armored warfare, Sidi Rezegh matters because it shows the promise and peril of mobility. Tanks could reach deep into the enemy's system, but only a disciplined combined arms force could turn that reach into lasting success.